Heathrow Airport, a last-ditch attempt to prevent the deportation of a young Bangladeshi woman, Afia Begum. Afia was granted permission to come to Britain to join her husband, her father, and most of her family. But tragically, her husband died in an accident, so she was ordered to leave after clearing up his affairs. She wanted to stay, but the Home Office said no. Both Afia and her baby must go back to Bangladesh.
Good evening. Tonight, we look at some of the cruelest choices currently being made in our name. The choice of which families we shall allow to make their home in Britain. The choice of whether to deport from these shores people who have lawfully entered the country, like it and are liked in return, and now want to stay. The Bible has it, that the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. But scarcely a week passes without the umpires at the Home Office lifting their fingers, declaring out a family which has lived and worked here for years, a wife from abroad whose British husband has died or deserted, a child born here whose parents have separated, or simply an immigrant who has become valued in the community, but whose papers, in that chilling phrase, are not in order. Well, the government says that strict immigration control is essential to good race relations and economic well-being. Its motto is firm but fair.
You better hold this ship then.
No.
On her last day in Britain, Mrs. Asia Hillel packs for herself and her 3-year-old daughter Shebnam.
Yes.
Let me see if we can close it.
She's leaving behind her 2 other children, Sabah and Sirhan, and her mother, all British citizens. This family is being split on a legal technicality. Mrs. Hillel's parents forgot to register her as British.
My recollection is that she even took the case to the Divisional Court, the Court of Appeal, and right up to the House of Lords. Now, nobody can say that her case has not been looked into properly. It's been looked into time and time again.
You know, I'm hoping the last minute or a few weeks after, David Waddington can change his mind and he can let me to come to stay with my children and with my family. He's been saying he's really compassionate man, but where is his compassionate? You know, he's been splitting all my family up. If I can run for a Britain, for a gold medal, he will allow me to stay because I'm a mother. He seems like he's not understand the points, he's only arguing on technicality.
At a school in East London, a children's campaign on behalf of 2 classmates born in Britain to a Turkish couple who'd worked here for 10 years. Their parents came as visitors, but overstayed. The Home Office ordered them out.
Anyone to play? Anyone have anywhere to live?
It would be grossly unfair if we were to say that because a strident campaign had been mounted in one case, the people concerned should be able to escape the consequences of their actions. We can't deport the children because they are British citizens, as has already been mentioned. But I've no doubt whatsoever that common sense will prevail and father and mother will depart with the children.
I feel very sad, and I want my dad back to stay in London.
Zainab, have you seen your friends lately?
No.
Do you miss them?
Yeah.
What would you say to your friends from school?
I can't say anything because I can't see them. And I'm missing school lessons. I don't like about my dad's gone. I feel sad because I want to stay with my friends and I want to stay in England. Because this is my country.
Well, common humanity prevailed. The family decided it had to stay together after the father was deported. Meanwhile, for another family of overstayers, just like the Hasbuducks, there's a happy ending.
We're going to have a big niece up there and everyone can come and help us celebrate. We can say a big thank you in person to everybody who's been helping us.
I think that's very important, to say thank you to everyone.
The Pereiras, too, had a fairly strident campaign behind them. Petitions from their neighbours in Hampshire and editorials in the Daily Mail. After all legal appeals had failed, David Waddington overruled his officials and allowed the Pereiras to stay. This, he said, was an exceptional case.
Well, there are some heart-wrenching choices, John Wheeler. As chairman of the Home Affairs Committee, why do they have to be made?
The moment the British people, acting through their parliament, decide to limit the numbers of people coming into the United Kingdom from other countries, you are at once in the dilemma of creating rules and regulations, and of their very nature, they are arbitrary. They create bad cases, and that is the difficulty. If you decide on the philosophy of control, you're into that kind of difficulty as exhibited in your films.
You say that they're arbitrary. Does that mean that firm and fair means firm for some and fair for others?
No, certainly not. But by the very nature of laws, by the very nature of rules, they are bound to be arbitrary. They are bound to create hard cases.
Bound to create hard cases. Let me ask you, Alf Dubs, the shadow spokesman on immigration. Firm but fair was actually a phrase coined by Merlin Rees. Do you see Labour as being able to get over the arbitrary nature of our immigration rules at present?
I think we must. The trouble is that what we have at the moment are immigration rules and practices which discriminate against people whose skins are not white. And that I find unacceptable, because if we discriminate against people at the point of entry into this country, then we can never be sure whether we aren't encouraging discrimination in all aspects of life in this country. And we say there shouldn't be any discrimination at all.
Let's step back a moment from the political argument and look at the actual basis of the test. It's based on patriality, which means having a near ancestor in this country, or was born in this country. Now, unless, of course, you happen to be one of the 200 million people who live in common market countries and can come here as long and stay so long as they have a job, or unless you have £150,000. If you have that money, then you can come in and stay for as long as you like, no matter where you come from. So, Peregrine Worsthorne, our rules seem based on blood and money, or EC membership. Would you wish a different test?
I think it's very difficult to find a perfect test which totally avoids unfairness. I mean, the fact, I suppose, is that these islands are very enviable places to live, both materially and in many other respects. They're one of the most civilized areas of the world. And there are millions of people all over the world who would like to come here, and I quite understand that, and therefore there have to be excluding rules, and how they are made totally fair, I think, would defy the wisdom of Solomon. I think that obviously if you are rich and can therefore guarantee that you will be no liability on the resources of the state, that is an advantage. There's no escaping that. I think probably if you come from Western Europe, where you can be received without, with the least difficulty of being integrated, because the cultures, the religions, the traditions are most similar, this will be an advantage. I think there can be no doubt about it that colored skin makes integration more difficult than a white skin. Therefore, the numbers factor will apply to colored skin. Presumably, this isn't a matter of argument. That everybody I read says that there is color discrimination in this country, whether one likes it or not. Presumably, therefore, that does make the problems of integrating more difficult. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it's a fact that there is, or at least one is told by many ethnic leaders that it exists. Is this racial discrimination that makes it more difficult to integrate people with dark skins?
Well, perhaps
this is
it
the reality.
Perhaps it makes Britain a more interesting country for the existence of that. Can I ask you, Canon Ivor Smith Cameron, do you go along with that? Is it more difficult to integrate?
Well, it's obvious that Mr. Worsthorne thinks that if you're black, you are the problem, and that, of course, is his problem. That, of course, is the underlying assumption behind the immigration laws, that the black people are the problem. May I give a personal example? Sure. You talked about patriality. I've lived in Britain for 35 years and been a priest for most of that time and been a British subject. My aged parents wanted to come to Britain to stay with me, but they weren't allowed to because neither of my parents nor their parents were born in this country. Now, Mr. Wheeler said that we have to be arbitrary, but I wish he had said we had to be racist, because that, in fact, is what has happened. there's no doubt in my mind that the immigration laws aren't about immigration, they're about black immigration. And it's about the black dimension which underlies our very unfair laws. And I'm ashamed of the natural justice of my country.
Well, can I ask now Anne Dummett, who's the director of the Runnymede Trust, is Peregrine Worsthorne's idea of millions of people waiting out there to swamp this country really correct today?
No, I don't think it's correct at all. I think people have got more sense. They're very well aware of the economic recession in Britain, and the pressure to come here that existed 20 years back for work is in that sense very, very much less. But there are much more important things to be said, touching on what Mr. Worsthorne has had to say. If it's been a good idea to control black immigration in order to make integration more simple, why on earth is it that in the period since 1962, when this sort of racially based, frankly racially based, immigration control first came in, it has got considerably worse? Experience shows nothing but disaster for this policy, and it's true that there are many other circumstances if you want to produce a controlled experiment, but it's certainly clear that it has not worked. It's nothing new and it has not worked. I think also Mr. Worsthorne has fallen into a serious logical fallacy, jumping from the fact that there is discrimination in this country to the supposition that therefore you have to have a form of racist immigration control. Surely the best way to overcome discrimination in the country would be for government and parliament to set the example of non-discrimination in their entry laws. And even more importantly in some ways, I think, in nationality law. There is no clear definition of Britishness in the law of this country. All other countries base their immigration policy on allowing their own nationals in and having a system of control over aliens. We have British people who are white, with very few exceptions, allowed in, and British people who happen to be black form the overwhelming majority of the British nationals who are subject to immigration control. This puts the sanction of the highest authority behind racism in this country, and until that is removed, I fear that discrimination and violence in this country will get worse.
Vishnu Sharma, could I ask you, do you have that same fear of our immigration laws being racist and actually stoking up violence?
Well, there are two sides of it. One is just a sort of academic discussion. And I think, the other side of the law is the actual practice. When we see in practice the policy as well as the law drafted in the light of that policy, one cannot avoid saying that the law is based on racial discrimination as well as on sex discrimination. Yes. And the successive governments, in fact, have been defending that. And if the law itself is discriminatory, and it is on the statute book, how on earth any government can claim that they are for harmonious race relations? Or then they talk about integration. And integration, in my opinion, if integration means in this country that an Asian woman or Asian person or black person from Caribbean should become a duplicate copy of British person, that will never happen, because they are proud of their cultures, they are proud of their... And I think if integration means that it is a mutual understanding as human beings, and people are treated like human beings, which are not being treated Asian and black people, then at least I can understand to a certain extent of this meaning of this so-called integration.
Let us move from the academic to the severely practical. Some of the people in the audience tonight are at the tough end of immigration control. Mohammed Idris, I think the Home Office at this very moment is seeking to deport you, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
How long have you lived here?
I have lived here for nearly 10 years now.
And where do you work?
I do work at the Asian Resource Center in Birmingham.
And I think you were a social worker at Dr. Bernardo's homes for some time.
I was. I worked for Dr. Bernardo's home for 5 years.
And why does the Home Office want to throw you out?
Can I go back to this story then? I'll tell you the story. I known my wife before I got married for 2 years. Then I got married. And my marriage was tested by the Home Office through intensive interviews. They tried to find out what was the primary purpose of my marriage. They tried to find out whether it was a genuine marriage or it was one of convenience. When we passed that test, they gave me 12 months to stay in this country. I applied back. It took them 1.5 years, another series of interviewing, and could not make up their mind. At the end of that 1.5 years, we found difficulty in our marriage, and within a week, Home Office decided that I cannot be allowed to stay in this country because my marriage has ended.
So you had a genuine marriage, and in the sense that, but it broke up, and as soon as it was showing signs of strain, the deportation notice was being prepared.
That's exactly right. When everything went right, it took them altogether 2.5 years. But as soon as something went wrong, it took them 1 week. But the moral question is, if this marriage has passed the test of the primary purpose and the genuinity, and they're stopping us to get together, deporting me will mean the permanent separation of the family. How can anybody morally, as at the beginning of the program it says, how can anybody morally justify that?
What would it mean to your aspirations as a person if you were deported to Bangladesh?
Well, I would not like to talk about Bangladesh people, because as soon as somebody faces deportation, people think there's something wrong with the country where people are deported. But what we say, there's something wrong with the law which is deporting people, and that is exactly the way.
My husband was deported to Iran 3 years ago. He was held at the Central Detention Centre in Manchester and then was deported through Heathrow Airport. My husband wasn't even given the humane rights of saying goodbye to his wife and children before he was deported from this country.
But why was he deported?
Well, they say my husband overstayed his visa.
But he married you?
But he was married to me and had 2 children here. Also, my husband was looking after 3 children from a previous marriage.
Why won't the Home Office allow you, as a woman born and resident here, to have your husband with you?
Well, you tell me this. It says in my marriage vows, what God puts together, let no man tear asunder. The Home Office has torn my marriage asunder. They have forced a form of divorce upon me and my husband. I haven't seen my husband for over 3 years, and neither has his children. My husband broke no law in this country. I was born in this country, my children were born in this country, and all my husband wanted to do was to have a normal married life here. For 3 years I have fought the Home Office completely alone until 3.5 months ago, along with the help of Alf Morris, to have my husband brought back to this country where I believe he has a right to be, whether he be black or white.
Could I ask John Wheeler, as a general proposition, why shouldn't British women be able to marry the person of their choice and live with him in this country?
As a general proposition, I cannot see any objection to that.
And yet we've had one. Are there any others? I think there was another woman there. Yes, would you?
I applied for my fiancé to come over from Pakistan, but he was refused on the grounds that he only wanted to come to England to find a job. They asked him, would you follow your fiancée wherever she was? And he goes, yes, I would do, providing there was a good job for me to do when I got there. And I don't see there was anything wrong in him saying that.
Juliet Cheetham, you're a commissioner at the Commission for Racial Equality. What impact do the hard cases that we've heard about have on race relations in this country?
I think the gravest implications of the operation of immigration control that I was aware of were those that affected wives and children of people in the new Commonwealth who were waiting to join men settled here. Now, these are men who often had to work for some years before they're in a position to sponsor their families, and having applied for their entry, families will have to wait for at least a year before they're interviewed, and then may have to wait for many further years, certainly many months, while they cross or try to cross the various hurdles which lie in their way to get entry clearance. The operation of this control doesn't presume that people have a right which they're trying to establish. It's more likely to presume that they're lying and cheating, and you have to somehow disprove this. So the net result is that something like, I think, 1 in 5 wives are now refused admittance, and 2 in 5 children. Now, these are women, many of them from Orthodox religious backgrounds, and the presumption is that somehow they're passing themselves off, or want to pass themselves off, as bogus wives. Now, I can't imagine a similar system operating with the wives and dependents of white men who settled in Australia. Now, this kind of separation or division of families, I mean, families are divided initially because that's one of the consequences of migration, but the delaying of the reunion, I think, is inhumane and unjust, and we do have a choice to do it differently.
John Wheeler, you said at the beginning that it was arbitrary. You've heard examples and indeed evidence that it's not just arbitrary, but can be inhumane and unjust.
The case that we're discussing now is undoubtedly the men from Sylhet in the district of Bangladesh, which I'm going to visit again in this November to look at these very problems of how you process the dependents through to the United Kingdom. It is exceedingly difficult. The bureaucracy of that country is such that there are not records. So there's no easy way in the manner of the West to identify people's rights. And our immigration officers have a very difficult job, but they try to be fair. Now, it is true that there are some people who wish to cheat, because the pressure to leave that country is very great.
But there are many who don't cheat, and there are many British...
But that's the dilemma, isn't it? How does a civil servant who is trying to do an honest and honourable job determine who is playing the rules, by the rules, and who is not? Now, it is very easy to say, in the case of those that have found difficulty with the system, that it's wrong. Find a better system.
Could I people who have right to come into this country because they spent all their life working in here when you wanted labor in this country. Yeah. You brought them there in 1950s and 60s, and now their families are separated.
I think if I may say, that gentleman puts his finger on a very important point.
Yes.
The British people and the British politicians began immigration in the 1950s. We are left today with the legacy of those decisions.
Can I ask the gentleman in the green?
I wanted to say is that we're talking about people who have been here for 30, 40 years, whose rights are being destructed. The destruction of families, the destruction of laws which have come in to stop these people in having families together. That's the basics. You look at the effects of the child whose brother or whose sister is being deported. Or you look at the effects of families who are waiting. Look at the psychological effects of those people. What is the people going to think? What race relations are you thinking about? What equal opportunity have you got for black people? You're talking about destruction of culture, talking about destruction of those families.
It seems to me that these very justifiable complaints about the problems that arise from earlier unrestricted immigration, complaints which are absolutely genuine, all these social problems that make people extremely distressed and very angry, illustrated in this audience. This surely illustrates the inadvisability of any period of unrestricted immigration, because we're living with the consequences. Your anger, your grievance, your hatred of this country.
Let me take up Peregrine Worston's point about hatred of country. Is criticism of immigration officials and government policy a hatred of this country?
I don't think that's true at all. I don't hate this country. I love it. I'm a British citizen. I've served this country. I've served the church in this country. But I cannot love the injustices of this government or of the previous one. Let's make no bones about it. And nor indeed of the law. The difficulty is once a thing is written into law, it becomes extremely grave and serious. And I think that Peregrine mustn't forget that it was Enoch Powell and people like him who did go to the Caribbean and so on, urged people to come to their motherland. The British transport, the nursing profession would have come to a halt if it wasn't for black people. But as soon as their value was used up, and as soon as white people felt that their jobs were being taken, then they turned on the black people. Now, you cannot expect black people not to feel a deep resentment.
I'd like to go back to the primary purpose rule, because a lot of people
What does the primary purpose rule mean? Can you explain it?
That if an immigration officer is not satisfied that the person, a husband, and now it extends to a wife also, is coming to this country for settlement, then he will be refused. Now, the thing is that they're attacking genuine marriages. Home Office is saying we accept that the marriages are genuine, but the primary purpose of your entry is settlement in this country. Now, I can't understand this, because how can you justify this on humanitarian ground at all? And how can it be fair and firm?
Can I ask Jackie Barber, have you had some experience in primary purpose rule
Yes,
cases?
we have a lot of experience with these sort of cases, and as you say, the trouble is it's impossible to prove what the primary purpose of your marriage is if you're up against an immigration officer, or indeed the Home Office, who suspect that any particularly Asian man aiming to enter this country is coming here to get jobs, to seek settlement, to leave his own home. The difficulty is that people have to prove something that it is absolutely impossible to prove. They don't have to prove that their marriages are genuine. It's accepted that even a genuine marriage is not sufficient to allow somebody to come here. We have cases of people who have been together for years, who have children, where there's no dispute that they intend to stay together, who are being refused entry simply because an immigration officer has not been satisfied that the person is not coming primarily for immigration purposes. And it is, as you said before, a case of being guilty before you're judged. It's the opposite of any other area of law.
Are there any women in the audience who've actually lost their husbands under the primary purpose rule?
My name is Gurdeep Kaur Sareen. I've been living in this country for the past 11 and a half years. I was 11 years old when I came to this country. I'm a British citizen. I went back to India and got married. And I was expecting my baby, and I had dysentery. And I couldn't stay there any longer. I tried to, but everything was impossible for me. So I came back. My husband applied, and the Home Office accepts our marriage as genuine, but they still refused him entry.
Because you couldn't show that part of his purpose was not to settle here.
I've got a 2-year-old daughter, and my husband was unable to see her for that time. He's over here.
Could I ask Martin Stevens, you're a Conservative Member of Parliament, and you've heard John Wheeler earlier in the evening saying that it is unfair that women who are British, who are allowed to, who live here, should not be able to marry and stay with their husbands. What is the purpose of the rule that keeps them apart?
Well, I must say that having heard what's been said so far, you've gathered together a group of people, many of whom have had special problems and no doubt have a justified feeling that they've been done wrong to. I've been handling immigration cases in Fulham for nearly 15 years now, and I don't recognize the society we're hearing described, because of course there are more black people deported or not allowed into the country than white ones, because there are more black people than white ones who want to come. The waiting time depends on the numbers of people involved. But we are trying, and with some degree of success, to bring absolute fairness into this very difficult and for many people tragic situation.
And we've already heard that absolute fairness is very difficult. Could I ask Zabanu Gifford, you are the Liberal Party's Community Relations Group Officer. Can you suggest a way in which the rules can be made more fair?
If we have to have a cautious immigration policy, then maybe some of the solutions might be that John Wheeler will have more immigration officers in the Indian subcontinent to process what's happening and to properly train them. I was at a meeting with one immigration officer who said to me, "I've been told to be robust with those people." Now, that's not the sort of thing they should be trained to say. They're there to do a job and not to be racist. You also said to us, what is Britishness? Now, one thing which Britishness is justice. And your law is unjust because it's racist and sexist. And it makes me feel very embarrassed to be British, and I am British. When I was in Kenya, I was stopped at immigration, and I was told that I couldn't go back to England. I'd been an illegal immigrant, and I had to prove to them that I was a councillor and I'd fought a parliamentary election before they believed that I'd be allowed re-entry into my own country. Now, that can't possibly be right.
Fairness and justice, Alf Dubs, is that something that you want to put into the law?
Well, of course we do. Can I comment on the question that Martin Stevens didn't answer? There is one reason why we have the primary purpose rule, and one only. It was invented to keep the numbers of people coming in down, because that's the basis of the government's policy. There is no other justification for a policy which converts immigration officers and entry certificate officers into people who are supposed to know about the deepest motives for marriages. It was never their job, it should never have been their job, and the whole thing is a nonsense.
I belong to a parliament which champions the cause of liberty. But within that, the British people themselves lay down the ground rules. The British people themselves say whether they want to have immigration from other countries, regardless of where people come from. And the message is quite clear, they do not. Now, when they say that, they then oblige me, as a member of Parliament, to try and enact their wishes. That is the difficulty. All politicians, regardless of party, since 1962, both Labour and Conservative, and I assume any future government, regardless of where it may come from, will be faced with the same dilemma. They will have to have laws, they will have to have rules, and those laws and rules will create hard cases, some of which we've been learning about tonight.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wheeler said that the laws represent what the broad-minded British public want. Now, somebody asked the question of morality. Would you forgive me if I introduce the fact that in this country, all the churches, the whole Roman Catholic Church, the British Council of Churches, the black churches, all the Christian communities in this country have condemned the immigration laws and the Nationality Act. They do at least speak a little bit for the moral facts of this country. So if it's a question of morality, there is a body of opinion within this country which has spoken.
The facts are, as we all recognize, that there are very considerable moral problems which arise through immigration. This is true in all societies. Families are left behind, families are broken up. This is true of the immigration laws of all countries. What one has to address oneself is, given that as the starting point of any realistic discussion of immigration, how do you most likely to minimize these difficulties? Some people say, change the laws, make it easier to come in. Other people say, you stop them at the source by having very strict rules which stop the problem getting out of control in the first place. It is ridiculous to say that one argument is moral and one argument is immoral. My own view happens to be that there are less moral tragedies arising from a strict immigration policy than one that is unstrict. And I think the experience of this country in my lifetime bears this point out. I do not accept the view that my position is any less moral than the canons. I think they're both moral positions. In my view, mine does less moral harm than yours.
All I can say to Peregrine Worston is that, of course, if you believe that this society is basically a white society and have not embraced and accepted the multiracial character of this society, you will say what you say.
Can anybody believe that this country is not primarily a white country?
Being British, what does that mean to members of the audience? Yes.
I don't see how you can ask someone like me or any other woman here or a lot of the men what it means to them to be British, because we have not ever been given the chance to assess ourselves as British. If we've got immigration laws which control us, our families, if we're told to leave this country because we're second citizens, how can we ever say to you what we feel about being British? Until we're given that chance, then we can answer your question.
Right. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Let me thank our audience for their evidence and opinions volunteered so freely. May I thank our panel. And may I say that at the end of the day, we talk about glorying in the name of Britain. I wonder whether that glory depends on whether our society has the generosity of heart to share the name of Britain, not just with those who automatically obtain it by blood or by money, but those who earn it by love. Good night.